They told me the warnings were tradition. That is what the senior ranger said on my first day, standing at the edge of the district map with a cup of coffee, going cold in his hand. He tapped the northeastern corner of the map, a section shaded differently from the rest, not marked on any version of the park available to the public. He said the old rangers left notes, said I would find them eventually, said when I did, I should read them and then make my own decisions about what to believe. He retired 4 months later. I never got to ask him what he believed. My name is Daniel Kowalski. I have been a backcountry ranger in Yellowstone National Park for 6 years. For the last 2 of those years, I have been assigned to what the internal designation calls Zone 7. The public maps call it the Absaroka Buffer. Most rangers call it the Quiet Section, which is either a joke or a warning, depending on who is saying it and what they have seen out there. I am writing this down because the last ranger who held my position left a journal, and the ranger before her left one, too, and I think by now the leaving of journals is itself part of the job, some kind of handshake between the people who come after and the people who came before. A way of saying, I was here. I saw what I saw. Make of it what you will. So, here is what I have seen. Zone 7 covers approximately 40 square miles of backcountry in the northeastern corner of the park. It borders the Absaroka mountain range to the east and a thermal field to the west that does not appear on public geological surveys. The thermal field is real. I have stood in it. The ground is warm underfoot even in February. Steam rises from cracks in the rock in thin white columns that disappear 20 feet up into whatever weather is happening overhead. There are no geysers, no mud pots, no tourist features, just the heat, steady and sourceless, pushing up through the earth. The zone is closed to the public, has been since 1973. The official reason listed in park documentation is geological instability, which is true in the way that describing the ocean as wet is true. Accurate, but incomplete. I patrol Zone 7 alone, 4 days on, 3 days off, rotating through a circuit of 11 established waypoints. The circuit takes 2 days to complete if nothing interrupts it. Something usually interrupts it. I want to be precise about what I mean by that before I continue, because precision matters and because I am not a person given to exaggeration. I was an Army Ranger before I came to Yellowstone. I spent 4 years in places where the difference between accurate observation and wishful thinking was the difference between coming home and not. I trust my eyes. I trust my training. What I am about to describe is what I observed, recorded in my field log at the time of observation, and later cross-referenced against the journals left by the 2 rangers who held this posting before me. The journals matched. That is the part I keep coming back to, not any single incident, not any one strange night or unexplained sound or wrong shape seen between the trees. The matching. 3 people who never met, working the same territory years apart, writing down the same things. I found the first journal in the supply cache at waypoint 4, which is a metal box bolted to a boulder about 6 miles into the interior. Inside the cache, there are the things you expect: emergency rations, a first aid kit, backup batteries, a laminated copy of emergency protocols, and underneath all of it, wrapped in a plastic sleeve, a composition notebook with the name R. Calloway written on the inside cover. Ranger Calloway held my possession from 2009 to 2014. Her entries were methodical. Dates, weather conditions, wildlife observations, maintenance notes. She was a professional. Her handwriting was small and even, and she did not waste words. The unusual entries began in her 3rd month. She wrote about the elk. Yellowstone has one of the largest elk populations in North America. In most of the park, elk are a constant presence. In Zone 7, they are not. In 6 years of patrolling the zone, I have seen elk cross the boundary from the adjacent areas perhaps a dozen times. They come in a few steps, stop, and then leave. Not spooked in the way an animal is spooked by a predator, that sudden explosive movement, the whites of the eyes. Something slower than that, more deliberate, like a decision. Calloway wrote about this in month 3. She had noticed the same behavior. She had also noticed, and this is where her entries shifted in tone, that the elk did not just stop at a fixed line. They stopped at different places on different days. The elk were avoiding. It was not that the elk were avoiding. It was not the zone. It was the heat. I went back through my own field logs after reading this. I had noted the elk behavior but had not plotted it. I plotted it after reading Calloway's journal. Her circle and my circle were not identical because animal behavior is not geometry, but they overlapped enough to make the hairs on my arms stand up in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. The second journal was harder to find. I discovered it by accident in my 2nd year, during a maintenance check on the old patrol cabin at Waypoint 9. The cabin is not used for overnight stays anymore. Structurally, it is sound, but it was decommissioned in the mid-90s for reasons the park records describe as administrative consolidation, which is the kind of phrase that means someone decided it was easier to write a vague explanation than an honest one. Behind a loose board in the back wall, I found a coffee can. Inside the coffee can, folded into quarters, was a letter. Not a journal. A letter, written to whoever came next, dated 1991, signed with a first name only, Walt. I have read Walt's letter many times. I am going to tell you what it said, not in his exact words, because those feel like they belong to him, but in the substance of them. Walt wrote that he had been patrolling what he called the Northeast Thermal Sector for 3 years. He wrote that in his first year, he had experienced what he described as the sounds. He capitalized it that way. The sounds. He wrote that they came from below, not from any specific direction, but from the ground itself, and that they were not geological. He had worked a posting near a thermal field before. He knew what geological sounds were. Pipes and knocks and low grinding, the earth doing its slow work. He wrote that these were different. He described them as rhythmic. He wrote that in his 2nd year the sounds became more frequent and began to occur at consistent times. Not every night, but when they came at the same hour. Between 2 and 3 in the morning. He had checked this against his logs repeatedly, and the correlation held. He wrote that, in his 3rd year, he had done something he was not sure he should have done. He had gone toward the sounds instead of away from them. He described what he found as a location he had walked past dozens of times without registering it as significant. A flat shelf of rock at the western edge of the thermal field, perhaps 20 feet across, where the steam vents were concentrated and the ground was warmest. He had been to this spot before, on his patrol circuit. In daylight it was unremarkable. At 2 in the morning in February, it was not unremarkable. He wrote that the ground was moving, not violently, not in the way of an earthquake or a thermal eruption, slowly, a gentle rhythmic rising and falling, like something breathing. And the sounds, when he stood on that shelf of rock, were coming from directly beneath his boots. He stood there for a long time. He wrote that he could not make himself leave quickly, which surprised him, because he was not a man who frightened easily, and he was frightened. But there was something else underneath the fear, he wrote, something that felt almost like recognition, like being in the presence of something that had been there long before he arrived, and would be there long after he was gone, and finding that less threatening than humbling. He left. He never went back at night. He wrote at the end of the letter that he was not telling anyone officially, because he had thought about how it would sound. He was writing it down in case the next person experienced the same thing, so they would know they were not losing their mind. He wrote, "It is old. I do not know what it is, but it is old, and it is not dangerous, and it knows we are here." I read that letter for the first time on an October afternoon, with good light coming through the cabin windows, and I sat with it for a long while before I put it back in the coffee can and put the coffee can back behind the board. I want to be clear about what I did next. I did not go looking for the location Walt described. I am a scientist by temperament, if not by training, and I understand that wanting something to be true is one of the most dangerous distortions available to the human mind. I went back to my regular patrol schedule. I logged my observations in the normal way. I did not mention Walt's letter in any official capacity. What happened next was not something I went looking for. It was my 14th month in Zone 7, February, which matters because February is the month Walt specified. The temperature was -18 Celsius, and the sky was the kind of black that only exists far from city light, dense and total. I was at Waypoint 8, about a mile from the thermal field, running a routine check on the remote sensors that monitor seismic activity in the sector. The sensors were showing something, not an event. The system flags events, eruptions, ground shifts, significant thermal changes. This was not an event. It was a pattern in the baseline data, a low-frequency oscillation that repeated at regular intervals, the kind of thing that could be a sensor error, a calibration drift, ice interference with the equipment housing. I noted it in my log, tagged it for review. Then I heard it. I want to be careful here. The human mind in darkness and cold and isolation is not a perfectly calibrated instrument. I know this. I have known this since my first winter in the zone, when I learned to sit with strange observations until I could test them, rather than immediately reaching for explanation or alarm. I stood still for a long time, with my gloves off and my bare hands against the sensor housing, feeling for vibration. The housing was vibrating, faintly, rhythmically. I checked my watch. It was 14 minutes past 2 in the morning. I am not going to tell you that I walked toward the thermal field that night, because I did not. I am going to tell you that I stood at Waypoint 8 for 37 minutes, listening to a sound that came from the ground beneath 8 inches of snow and frozen earth. A sound that was low and slow and regular as breathing, and that when it stopped all at once, like something choosing to stop rather than running down. And I am going to tell you that I was not afraid. That is the thing I keep returning to. Not the sound, not the sensor data I pulled the next morning that showed the oscillation clearly in the logs, a clean rhythmic wave lasting 31 minutes, beginning at 2:03 and ending at 2:34. Not even the cross-reference with Callaway's notes, which contained a single entry that I had not fully understood on first reading, an entry that said only 2 a.m. again. Felt it through my boots this time. Old, I think. Not a threat. Not any of that. The thing I keep returning to is that I was not afraid. I have been afraid in this job. A grizzly cut off my retreat at Waypoint 3 in my first autumn, and I was afraid then, correctly and usefully. I have been afraid of the cold, of the distances, of the particular silence that means weather is coming faster than forecast. Fear in wild places is information. It tells you something true about your situation. Whatever was under that ground was not sending the signal that triggers fear. It was sending something else, something I do not have a precise word for. The closest I can come is the feeling of standing in a very old building, a cathedral, maybe, or a place where something important happened long before your time. The awareness of duration, of having stumbled into the presence of something that measures time in units you do not have the instruments to read. I have told one person about this, a geologist with the USGS who was doing survey work in the adjacent district and came through the zone with a research permit in my 3rd year. She was sharp and unsentimental, and I trusted her enough to describe what I had observed without interpretation, just the facts, the sensor data, the timing, the frequency of the oscillation. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There are organisms on this planet that are older than complex life. Microbial mats, fungal networks, things that predate the Cambrian. We find them in thermal environments, mostly. Places where the chemistry is stable enough over geological timescales to allow for continuous persistence." She paused. "We do not fully understand what they do. We do not fully understand whether activity in large enough colonies could produce oscillation detectable at the surface." She paused again. "It is not outside the realm of known biology. She did not tell me I was wrong. She also did not tell me I was right." She packed up her equipment and moved on to the next waypoint, and we never spoke about it again. That is the most scientific framing I have for what is under Zone 7, an organism, old beyond any useful reckoning, alive in some fundamental sense that does not require eyes or limbs, or the ability to move toward light, aware, in some sense that I cannot prove, but that every person who has stood on that ground at the right hour seems to come away believing of the small warm things that walk above it. I am in my 6th year now. My patrol schedule has not changed. The sensor data continues to show the oscillation on irregular but recurring nights, concentrated in February and March, lighter through the summer, returning in autumn. I have stopped trying to build a definitive explanation and started simply recording what I observe, the way Calloway did, the way Walt did before her. I have started my own journal, will write in it what Walt wrote in his composition notebook. I will write in it what Walt wrote in his letter, because after 6 years I believe he was right. It is old. I do not know what it is. It is not dangerous, and it knows we are here. The senior ranger who trained me, the one who retired 4 months into my posting, told me on his last day something I did not fully understand at the time. He was loading his truck in the parking lot outside the district office, boxes of personal items, a lamp, a framed photograph, the ordinary archaeology of a career being packed up. I asked him what he would miss most. He thought about it for a while. Then he said, "The feeling that you are not the most significant thing in a place, that you are just passing through something that was there before and will be there after." He looked at me. Most people never get to feel that. Not really. They live their whole lives as the main character of everything. He drove away, and I went back to work, and I did not think about what he said for almost a year. I think about it now every time I walk the circuit at Zone 7, every time I cross the edge of the thermal field and feel the ground warm through my boots despite the cold. Every time I file my sensor logs and see that low, slow wave moving through the baseline data like a pulse. Something is down there. Something old and patient and entirely indifferent to what we call important. And 6 years in, I think the reason the old rangers left their warnings was not to frighten the people who came after them. It was to prepare them for the opposite of fear, for that rare, specific feeling of standing above something ancient and realizing, with your whole body, rather than just your mind, exactly how briefly you have been here. "Read the journals," the senior ranger told me on my first day. "I have read them. I have added to them. Whatever comes next to this posting We'll find them in the cache at waypoint 4, underneath the emergency rations, waiting in the dark, the way everything in Zone 7 waits, patiently, without urgency, as if time is not the problem it always seems to be from the surface.